The war is coming home, and Putin's desperate manpower shortage is now forcing him to lock down Russia. You see, the Russian soldiers are collapsing on the front lines. But despite catastrophic losses, Putin is now cutting bonuses for new soldiers while demanding higher recruitment numbers from his commanders. This tells us that his bloodthirsty conquest is now becoming unaffordable. But this does not mean that he wants to stop. That's why, to find more bodies, Putin has turned entirely draconian. He has launched a secret mobilization, effectively locking down 2 million young Russian men and slowly closing the entire country. The plan is backfiring though. Russians are furious and they're calling his ban on NATO countries a new Iron Curtain. Because they know this ban is not about national security, it's about keeping them inside the country so the Kremlin can mobilize. This fear, anger, and betrayal are why Russians are now publicly speaking out against this new law, proving that Putin's war is now against his own people. Our story starts with laws Putin has passed over the last few months. Take a look at this newest one, where the Russian parliament is debating whether they should ban Russians from visiting NATO countries. Now, as you guys can guess, I'm a big fan of this law, but some Russians are not a fan. Here's one of the reactions.
So, friends, according to today's news, the State Duma is planning to consider a law that would prevent Russians from traveling to NATO countries. I'm just wondering how it will be implemented. I want to go to Italy or Montenegro. It also belongs to NATO. And what? I mean, I won't be able to? Can I fly to Istanbul? But I can't go? Where can I fly? Based on this law, I will not be able to fly anywhere. And what remains? Buying a ticket here through the Arab Emirates because it's not a NATO country? And then from here to fly somewhere. You know, I recently wrote a post about bans on my Telegram channel. I was shocked that they start to forbid us everything. And now they will tell us where to go. Guys, where are we heading? What's going on?
So let me get this straight. These Russians have no issue with Putin invading a sovereign country, killing Ukrainians, or even sending drones in NATO countries. But they do have an issue when Putin tries to ban them from visiting these NATO countries. According to these people, the West is evil until their vacation in Milan gets cancelled. But I'm getting off topic. This is not the important part of the story. Sure, some Russians are angry, but what's new over there? The important story is, why is Putin passing this law and why is he doing it now? Why not do this in 2022, 2023, 2024? Well, to understand this, we have to look back to September 2022. Just months after the invasion, when Putin realized that his 3-day special military operation was not gonna end in 3 days. That meant he needed more Russian men to throw at the front lines, so he can finally fulfill his dream of rebuilding the Soviet Union. That's why, in September of 2022, Putin made one of the most disastrous decisions he has ever made. He announced a nationwide partial mobilization. The goal was to draft 300,000 Russian men, but this resulted in chaos, panic, and one of the biggest human outflows Russia has ever seen. Within hours of that announcement, every single flight out of Russia was sold out. Men fled to Kazakhstan, Georgia, Finland, any country that would take them. By some estimates, nearly 1 million Russians left the country within a week of this announcement. On top of this, Russian streets were filled with protesters, especially in places like Dagestan, where even women confronted the police. Over 2,000 people were arrested, and some even set fire to draft offices. Just to show how crazy things got, in one case, a man literally shot an enlistment officer point blank. On top of this, and this is the crazy part, even some local politicians in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg were calling on Putin to resign. Now that's something we never see in Russia, and that's something we don't see even right now, with 1.1 million Russian casualties. So clearly, Russians don't like mobilization. But even on the economic front, this decision was disastrous. Millions of people who left were skilled workers and IT professionals that Russia's economy desperately needed, especially when Putin was already sending millions of men to fight in Ukraine. Officially, unemployment figure hit record lows, not because things were going good, but because there were no men left to hire. In fact, at this time, the Russian central bank came out and publicly said that the workforce collapse could cripple the whole country. So, because of all this, Putin realized one thing. Even though he got the men he needed, more soldiers, it told the public that the war was not under control. And that's something Putin does not want to do again. That's why, after this whole episode, Russia shifted its strategy. They still needed men, but instead of mobilizing people against their will, they started paying people to come die for their country. We have already covered this in detail on the channel, and some of the Russian regions were getting insane. Someone who was in debt and damn near bankrupt could become a millionaire in rubles just overnight by signing a piece of paper with the defense ministry, basically by signing a contract. In fact, in some regions, the bonuses were as high as 2 million rubles. Now, this was a good solution, at least temporarily. It gave Putin what he wanted, more men, and it also did not create an internal problem that would threaten his power. But you see, this war is dragging on for a lot longer than Putin had hoped. He was hoping just 3 days. But the long war also means that the Russian casualty figures are just out of this world. In fact, The Economist recently published some interesting data. Every 117th Russian man has died in this invasion. That means Russia has lost around 1% of all men under 60. And in return for this, Putin has captured around 0.4% of Ukrainian territory this year. That doesn't mean Putin is going to slow down. He's ready to kill an infinite amount of people for the sake of his imperialist ambition. However, this year, his brilliant solution that he came up in 2022 was starting to slow down. In the second quarter of 2025, only 38,000 Russians signed the contract with the army, which is almost 3 times less than what the figure was just a year ago. In 2024, nearly 100,000 Russians had joined within that time frame. The reason for this drop is twofold. First of all, Russians are realizing that it's really freaking dangerous to go to the front lines. All these Russians are coming from these far-flung villages where every single day they're seeing casualty numbers just pile up. And on top of that, all the while Russians are realizing the true risk of this operation, the bonus they're getting for taking on that risk is also going down. That's because Russia is running out of money. We have already covered why. And I'm sure all of you guys know why. Ukrainian drones, aka Ukrainian sanctions, have destroyed roughly 38% of Russian refining capacity. And on top of that, the new US sanctions are truly hurting Russia's ability to export like they used to. That's why we are seeing Russian regions already cut down on the crazy high bonuses that they were offering. Just a few months ago, many regions that were just throwing money around stopped doing that. And on top of that, some regions actually started pulling back the money that they had already promised to the soldiers who are fighting on the front lines. This was definitely one of the most insane stories I have ever read. Russians at the front that joined the military in St. Petersburg are finding out that their big payment that convinced them to join this war is not coming. In fact, they have been cancelled retroactively. The St. Petersburg parliament passed a law on August 26th that basically cancelled any payment that their city had promised since August 1st, which is insane. How can they go back and just cancel on the promise when people are fighting already? In my life, I have a pretty simple rule. You don't want to piss off people with guts. And it seems Putin may want to start following the same rule. Jokes aside though, instances like these show us truly how serious problems are that Russia is facing. They're not just cutting pay, they are crawling back pay. Now, of course, Putin still needs more men, so he had to get creative. This is where he turned to the secret mobilization. Just recently, the Russian State Duma passed a bill that changes how the Russian military draft works. Before, there used to be 2 separate windows, one in fall and one in spring. Well, now there's just one big window that never closes, kind of like Buc-ee's in Texas. That's a horrible analogy, but we'll keep it in there. Now, according to this law, Russian government can basically conscript people anytime. And this is where I need to explain the difference between the Russian army and Russian conscripts. You know, technically speaking, conscripts in Russia are not allowed to be sent to the front lines in Ukraine. That's because, according to Russian law, these conscripts cannot leave the country unless there's a war. And according to Putin, this is not a war, this is just a special military operation. Now remember this law, because we'll come back to this in just a second. But even now, it doesn't seem like that these conscript officers, or whatever they're called, are actually following the law. A lot of these conscripts, who are still kids by the way, they're 18 and 19, they're teenagers, a lot of them, are basically forced into signing a contract with the Russian military once they are near their conscription period. This way, Putin can frame this as, hey, all these soldiers, they voluntarily signed a contract, when in reality, they're literally being forced into signing a contract. And sometimes, if they refuse to sign, they're being tortured to make sure they don't refuse anymore. And according to some interviews that Russian media has conducted on the front lines, some of the soldiers who were fighting there said they didn't even sign a contract. They were just shipped off without even knowing where they were going. And then they have their commanders on the front lines literally yelling at them, telling them, hey, go on this assault and go fight. Just listen. This sounds like a fake story, but it's actually true.
Isten to commands. If you refuse to do your tasks, I swear on my mother's life, I swear on my children's lives, I will personally shoot you. Every one of you. I'll report you as missing, and then I'll shoot every one of you. I don't give a fuck. I have permission. You all, this whole batch, are fucking scum. Except for that person over there. There he is. You are all scum. Now prove to me that you are men. Now I'm asking each one of you.
And I do want to remind people again that these soldiers are kids. They are 18, 19, teenagers, a lot of them. And this is something Ukrainian soldiers have talked about, how as this war drags on, the Russian soldiers are getting younger and younger. And that's why we're seeing a lot of people in Russia who have been called up in this recent conscription that Putin is carrying out. They're just fleeing the country. Here we have an example of a 21-year-old who ran to freedom. Now, of course, Putin cannot afford this. He can't have his cannon fodder just run away. So he's having his police raid gyms and raid restaurants and raid nightclubs and basically arrest people and forcefully send them to the conscription grounds. In fact, human rights groups in Russia have reported that the Russian authorities are now using cameras at public spaces like metro station and traffic stops to identify men who have been called up for conscription and then arresting them from wherever they are. Now, this is where I do want to come back to that law that we talked about just a little bit ago. The law that says basically that conscripted men in Russia cannot be sent to the front lines. Well, according to that law, they cannot be sent to the front lines unless it's a war. Well, guess what? There's a law change happening in Russia as we speak. This new change would basically give Putin the ability to deploy these 2 million reservists that Russia has into Ukraine without actually having to declare war. Because that's what Putin fears the most. He does not want Russian population to think that he does not have things under control. And that's why he's going through all this mental gymnastics to basically mobilize the Russian population without actually declaring that there's a mobilization. And the craziest part is, all this happened in front of our eyes. First, he increased the conscription numbers, then he increased the timeline or the window of conscription, and then he's changing the law so he can deploy conscripts to the front line. He did it, most people didn't notice, including me. Like, he's probably at the end by now, and that's when people are figuring it out. And yes, for most kids, this is pretty much a death sentence. But for Putin, from his point of view, it's working. He's killing Russians, but he's gaining ground. He killed around 120,000 Russians in the Pokrovsk region alone. But it seems like, based on recent reports, that Russian forces may take over the city in the coming days or coming weeks. This just shows us that he does not care about human lives. He does not care about Russian lives. All he cares about is gaining ground. In fact, some reports show that Russian commanders have been ordered to gain ground no matter the cost. And that's exactly why we're seeing some horrendous battlefield clips coming out of that region. Just take a look at this one that me and Chuck Farr recently reviewed.
Okay, you definitely got some close quarters battle here. So that looked like a satchel charge, which is, yeah, that's what it was. A little close there on the breaching charge, bud.
So it was like some heavy car battery size thing. So yeah. It was not a grenade. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was probably, I don't know, maybe 5, 4, or 6 socks of C4. C4 comes in these long strips, and they're all individually wrapped in canvas. We call them socks, but it's a 2-pound sock. So that to me looked like maybe 3 or 4 2-pound socks. So that's like 8 pounds of C4, which is, I'll tell you what, 20 pounds of C4, if you put it on a big cement, those beach landing obstacles that are about 4.5 feet tall, 2 feet wide at the top and 4 feet wide at the bottom, 20 pounds of C4 will make that thing absolutely disappear. It blows it into sand. So that's about half that much. And you can see what it did to that house.
Now, that clip is just a small part of what we're doing every single week on Basics Insider. As you guys know, we cannot show you guys all these Battlefield clips here on YouTube because it's against YouTube guidelines. That's why we built our own platform, Basics Insider. Over there, we have no restrictions, so we can provide you uncensored coverage of what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on around the world. We don't have to blur anything that an advertiser doesn't like because we don't run ads on the website. We run the website through the support from you guys. So if you're someone who's interested in content like this and you want to watch the episode of Battlefield Breakdown, you should definitely go check out our platform by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on your screen. Or you can just go to basicsinsider.com. By joining, you'll be supporting the channel and supporting our coverage. So thank you so much. My name is Sam and I'll see you guys in the next video.